Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Policy Wall at ORF Middle East. Thank you, Richard, for joining us. It is wonderful to have you with us today. And because you're part of the tech community here in Dubai, and you're also the founder of an AI company yourself, I wanted to start off by first discussing with you or asking you about the ecosystem here in the UAE. Now, as we saw over the past month, the UAE delegation led by the National Security Advisor made a trip to the White House, and with the tech investments and US export controls as being some of the main items on the agenda. And then last week, the UAE Minister of Defense also made a trip to New Delhi. So I wanted to ask you, how does the UAE's geopolitical sort of positioning as like a node connecting the West with the East influence the tech startup system here in the country, especially given the increasingly like strategic importance of technologies like AI?
Indeed. Okay. Well, thank you for the question. I don't know if I'm uniquely positioned to answer the question, but I have had the privilege of working in global roles for American companies like IBM and Eastern companies like Huawei.
Yeah.
And so I've kind of sat on both sides of the equation. And coming from the public sector, somebody who's worked as a civil servant, I'm keenly aware of the role that politics and geopolitics play, even in technology projects. They are not immune to what's happening in the global environment. And I think one of the reasons that I was so grateful to be given the opportunity to live in the UAE is that when I'm representing a software solution or a technical solution to a government, I don't have to align myself with the East or the West. I think the biggest advantage to being in the UAE is that we are politically non-aligned. And when I was invited to move here 4 years ago, one of the values that was identified as a motivator was the fact that we are politically non-aligned and we are within an 8-hour flight of 80% of the world's population. And I think the value to that is quite considerable. Now, a slightly more cynical person might suggest that when you go into an area like Africa, one of the benefits is that they see us as having an awful lot of money. But I can say from my experiences over the last number of years that the funding or the financing part of that is not what's attractive. What's attractive to the clients that we're talking to in Central Asia, in Southeast Asia, and in Africa is the fact that the UAE is a friend to everybody and an enemy to no one. So I think we are very uniquely positioned, and I'm always amazed at the path that our leadership has been able to walk down this middle road, because I know politically it's a very challenging one. But each of us who are sitting in this country and working outside of it are benefiting from the fact that we have been able to navigate this in a way that means we don't get politically caught up. Because I think it's one of the biggest advantages that we have as a country.
No, thank you for that. That's very insightful, actually. Now, if we can just like move beyond politics for this next question. Now, obviously, as you mentioned in your answer, you have worked in the West, you have worked in the East, but then when you wanted to found an AI company, you decided to not be in California or not be in the EU. You wanted to be in the UAE. So what do you think are, beyond politics, what do you think are the main enablers that have allowed the UAE to sort of very quickly, in fact, become a global hub for tech investments? And what do you think are some of the high impact areas where the country is focusing its investments on regarding AI and other emerging technologies? And also, from your perspective, have you experienced any bottlenecks that need to be addressed to sort of meet the AI ambitions of the UAE?
Sure. Yeah, you're absolutely correct. I co-founded 2 AI companies, and both of them here in the UAE, notwithstanding the fact that I'm a European citizen and I've lived in North America for quite some time. I think it's because the UAE is neither one of those regions that this is so appealing. We have quite a bit of the funding that you would normally look to get from Palo Alto or from Silicon Valley. We have maybe not equivalent, but we certainly have access to funding like we do there, but in a geographically and politically far more advantageous position. We have a regulatory framework that really supports and promotes innovation and growth in these emerging areas in a way that is easier and more flexible than what you would find in Europe. I think for me, the hallmark of this region is the fact that we have such clear top-down commitment to making these changes. I haven't lived in Europe now for 3 or 4 years, but I struggle to imagine that there is a country in Europe that is speaking so vocally about the role that AI has to play in government. And even if there are countries that are talking about it, there are very few countries who can move from declaration to execution as quickly as what we do here in the UAE. And I remember one of my very first experiences back in 2020 was with the drive towards paperless offices. And it was an announcement that was made, and I might misremember, but I think it was made with like 6 weeks notice. And everybody then simply had to move to paperless processes. They just do it. You know, good decisions get made and then they get translated into execution very, very quickly here. So we have top-down commitment. We have access to funding, particularly early stage funding. We have an agile, flexible regulatory framework. We've got great talent here. Certainly at the lower and the middle tiers, a lot of the most innovative thinking is still happening perhaps in other parts of the world, but the ability to execute and to build things here is very, very strong. And of course, Dubai is a great place to live, and Abu Dhabi is rapidly catching up as a magnet for talent. I think in terms of bottlenecks, a couple of things that I've seen is that the leading edge of innovation is still happening in the United States. It's still happening in the US. And I think the numbers around investment in AI, for example, are still dramatically favoring Silicon Valley. I think it was 90% or more of funding, VC funding that was deployed on AI projects was coming out of California as recently as fourth quarter of last year. So there is still a huge imbalance that way. And here we find a very easy appetite to take the initial risk, but later stage funding is quite difficult to find in this part of the world. And I think because we are a relatively small market, we are surrounded by a whole bunch of other small markets, the ability to localize and internationalize is much bigger and much greater here. And that's a challenge as well. If you're in North America, you just deploy in one language. You have to meet 2, maybe 3 different regulatory schemas, and that's it. You've got access to 500 million people. Here, we need to deal with an awful lot more countries, a much more international, much more varied background that complicates things a little bit.
Right. And I think you brought up a very interesting and important point on talent. You mentioned that the UAE has a lot of resources, human resources in the lower and the middle tiers, but the top tier talent is still present in North America and Europe. And I think talent and human resources are one of the areas where AI will have the biggest impact. So let me ask you, given the UAE's proactive approach and early adoption for technologies like AI, how can investment in automation and AI be balanced with the sort of natural local apprehensions about the future of jobs?
Yeah, that's a really great question and a great segue, by the way. I think if I look at the conversation around AI, the fears around employment and employability don't come up as frequently in this part of the world as they do in Europe and in North America. I think there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, we have a shortage of people, right? We always have job opportunities. There's always work for people to do. And so we're not worried necessarily about being in a situation where our unemployment rate is going up. And that's certainly the case in some Western countries, that it's a bigger issue, even if you don't bring AI into the equation. The second thing is we are by nature inclined to think of things more as investment and revenue generating opportunities. We tend to think about the positive impact of change rather than think about cost savings, right, and the negative impact of change. But I also think it's because here the assumption is technology is to serve the people, and it's to empower people to do things better, to have a higher quality of life. And we've seen over the last 10 years in the UAE that technology has been deployed in a lot of really positive ways, but it has not, to my knowledge at least, been deployed as a cost-saving measure that translates into staffing reductions.
Yeah.
In the West, there are much more mature, much larger public sector organizations. Budgets are correspondingly much, much higher, under much greater pressure. Economic development is at a much lower rate than what you see here. And so I think there is an inclination for those governments to think about AI as a way of reducing the staff requirements. And I think that's really unfortunate, because I've worked on government projects in 82 countries around the world. I've worked for 2 different governments myself. And I can say quite honestly that I don't think I've run across a government that is overstaffed.
Yeah.
My experience is that governments have too many of their employees working on low value, high effort tasks. And so my default positioning when I'm talking to a government client is that we're using AI to release resources from having to do those low value, high effort tasks, and instead allow them to focus on the high value tasks. I think we are going to have to sit through the transformation of AI for another 5 or 10 years before we will really be able to see what the long-term impact is on employment. Because I'm not by nature a technologist. I don't really like technology. I only buy technology when it fundamentally has a positive impact on my life. But having said that, as a natural skeptic, I also think we have not yet fully understood just how transformational artificial intelligence is going to be. This is the first time that I think we've run across a technology where, despite all of the hype, I think we're still underestimating the impact. And I think we'll need to wait and see how that plays out.
Right. Now, yeah, I mean, I think I completely agree with you about the transformational potential of AI. And I also agree with you with the fact that we don't really know how the world will be after 5, 10, 15 years. The change could be very dramatic. And I think like that issue raises like a very important problem of like in this like global AI competition, this global AI race for leadership and dominance, how can governments increase technology adoption, which has become an economic and political imperative? How can governments increase technology adoption and sort of foster innovation while preserving alignment and ethical principles? Now, I think 2025 has become a very important year for the debate regarding ethics and safety and security. As I'm sure you know, in the 2025 Paris AI Action Summit, the US and the UK refrained from signing the declaration, which was for an inclusive AI development. However, the UAE did sign the declaration. Given that you're running AI companies in the UAE, to what extent or depth do you think AI developers and deployers need to consider ethics? And like, is there a right balance? And is the binary that is often presented between innovation and regulation, is that even real from your perspective?
Yeah, it's a great question. But let me declare my bias up front. Right? I represent the public sector.
Right.
I might be sitting in a private sector technology company, but my heart and soul sit inside the public sector. And we often position ourselves as a partner with government against traditional big tech, which is looking to move fast and break things. Right? And as somebody who's worked in public safety, for example, we can't afford to break things, because if we break things, people die.
Yeah.
So I think, number one, government has to take a role, and it has to be a leading role. I think governments need to be stepping up to govern the deployment of AI. And governance has two pieces. One is controllership, which governments are normally very good at. But the second part is leadership. And governments in particular are not particularly good at the leadership part of governance. So we need governments to be able to step up and take this leadership role in protecting the way that AI is being deployed and representing human rights, because that's really what it comes down to. I think there's a couple of different ways we could do that. And I think what the government of the UAE is doing hits on a couple of those right off the bat. Number one, to lead by example.
Right.
We've been very clear in stating that we think AI has a transformational potential, and our government is intent on making sure that it gets deployed the right way. And that gives us a moral high ground to talk to the companies who are coming in to say, this is how we expect things to be done. This is how we do it, and this is how we expect you to do it. Secondly, I think we need to have very open and honest dialogue about what's being done with AI. And I think, again, the UAE has taken a strong leadership role there. And we have to codify the principles into policy and planning and regulations and legislation. I think that's the way that we need to do this, and it creates the framework for a carrot and a stick, right? You can give companies freedom to do certain things when they show that they play by the rules. And if they don't play by the rules, then you remove some of those freedoms away from them. And I think to the final point that you made about the UAE signing the declaration, I think making sure that we're part of a global dialogue and we're stimulating a global dialogue is a really critical part of this. So I don't think there's anything that I would suggest beyond what we are already taking on here. But I think for other countries who are looking at what we're doing, I think one of the biggest pieces or the biggest recommendations that we can give to them is that you need to have in-house subject matter experts. You cannot always rely on the private sector to police itself. And if you're going to police the private sector, public sector has to be able to take a credible seat at the table.
Right.
And that's a difficult objective to achieve. But we've done it here. I think that proves that it can be done.
Right. And it just now like highlighted to me that while answering a previous question, you had mentioned that one of the problems with the UAE as a region is that it's surrounded by so many other jurisdictions with their own landscape, their own like culture, their own languages, their own politics, which is quite different from the US, where you can like go from training to deployment and then in just one language, and don't have to worry about any regulatory sort of overlap. So I think the point you made about being part of a global community, and I think that's a very prescient point. And I hope that this sort of global divergences in AI ethics and then AI regulation sort of dies down. And major players like the US, the UAE, China, and India, and the Europe are able to find some common ground in the future.
I think on that point, because you also tied into the concept of adoption, I think one of the things that we need to be clear is that every country is different. Even within countries, communities are different. And those differences are really valuable and really important, right? We don't need a one-size-fits-all, and we would never achieve a one-size-fits-all model for dealing with ethics and responsible use of AI. And that's okay. Yeah. Those differences make life worth living. However, what we need to make sure is that when there are differences from one country to another, that it's clear what those decisions are, and people have the ability to make informed decisions. But that's also important because a technology has to be relevant to the people of a country if they're going to use it. Right? And so when we, as a UAE-based organization, go in and talk to a different country, we're very, very cognizant of the fact that whatever we build for them has to look like them, smell like them, taste like them, sound like them, because they don't pay taxes in order to get a UAE-flavored solution. It's great that we can prove the core technology work, but in the end, everything does need to be local. And that includes the AI and the algorithms, and that's okay. As I said, when there are differences, though, we just want to make sure it's clear what those differences are, because AI has the potential to be used in bad ways just as it is in good ways, right? The technology itself is inherently without value. It will inherit its value from what we do with it, and we can choose to do good things or we can choose to do bad things.
Thank you for such like an insightful answer. And then I think we're reaching the end of our conversation. So for the final question, I'd just like to pick up a little bit on the issue of diversity that we just went over and a sort of distribution of all the benefits of emerging technologies like AI. And as both of us know, that the talk of innovation often raises like an important problem. Now, we know that the AI supply chain is globally distributed, from the procurement of materials to the deployment of AI in the market. However, the benefits of AI are not distributed evenly. And I think that's quite evident if you do a comparison between the global north and the global south. And so to ensure that the promises of emerging technologies and platforms like AI are not just reserved for the West, for the haves, what do you think are some strategies that can be deployed nationally or internationally to promote equitable distribution of benefits of frontier technologies?
That's a great question. And it's not unique to AI. We see this in every part of society and every part of industry. It's very clear that exploitation of natural resources benefits the West more than the global South, and the negative impacts of this exploitation are disproportionately greater in the global South than they are in the North or in the West. So this is an issue that comes up everywhere. In order to make sure that we have equitable distribution of value, I think there's a couple of things. The first comes back to adoption, right? Whatever we're going to do has to be accessible to the people that we are deploying services and solutions to. And we have to recognize that access to devices, to connectivity, and to electricity are not evenly distributed. So when we look at deployment of solutions, we need to think about that enabling infrastructure that sits underneath that. With AI, that's particularly manifested in accessibility to GPUs, right? To the compute infrastructure that's required to support an AI implementation. So we need to have an infrastructure play that supports whatever we're doing at the application level. And I know that the UAE has been thinking an awful lot about how do we deploy physical infrastructure into the global South. Secondly, we need to think about the culture, and we need to make sure that people understand how to interact with the technology. The concept of a digital native is actually still foreign in a lot of countries. And I think education is a really core part of that. And education is a key part then also of localization, making sure that whatever is being built is relevant, local, meaningful to the people of an individual country. What I would very much like to see then as a final objective in this are very in alignment with the ESG type of framework, or the sustainable development goal. Let's have really clear targets about reinvestment.
Right.
You know, one of the reasons that I have always been very focused on profit generation has nothing to do with being able to pay employees or pay myself. It has to do with the fact that profit gives us money that we can reinvest in local countries. And trying to find ways of having open, transparent discussions about what the commercial results of initiatives are, and making sure that we have a recognized example of what is a fair distribution of resources, I think is a great way of doing things, right? Democracy needs the light to survive. And I think being able to have this kind of open, transparent reporting and asking questions about how investments are being shared with the local countries is a key part of the discussion as well.
Wow. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Richard, for joining us today. This was a fantastic interview, and I'm sure all of our audience would really appreciate your insights.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for the time.
Thank you.